2.0 Pro Experimental, Kong ko quien trui kapvautong, tin teo toi gian tuk vamotsotin, nang qua gemini. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet, tree-lined streets of Lexington, Kentucky.
Welcome to Shadow Crime. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started.
Officer Mark Anderson, a veteran of the Lexington Police Department, sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, his eyes scanning the passing traffic. He prided himself on being a proactive officer, always on the lookout for anything that seemed out of place. A sleek, late-model Mercedes sedan caught his attention. It was a beautiful car, impeccably maintained, driven by a black woman. Anderson's gut clenched. Something about it, he couldn't quite put his finger on it, just didn't sit right with him. A car like that driven by her in this neighborhood, it just seemed suspicious. He pulled out his radio. Unit 42, requesting a plate check, he said, his voice tight with a barely concealed edge. He read off the license plate number to the dispatcher. While he waited for the results, he watched the woman in his rearview mirror. She was driving carefully, obeying all traffic laws. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't weaving, she wasn't doing anything remotely suspicious. But Anderson's gut told him otherwise. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming trouble. The dispatcher's voice crackled back over the radio. Plate comes back clean, registered to a Grace Williams, no outstanding warrants. Anderson frowned, clean record. That didn't fit his narrative, but he wasn't about to let it go. He'd pulled people over for less. Unit 42, initiating a traffic stop, he said, flipping on his lights and siren. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, the driver's actions calm and controlled. Anderson approached the vehicle, his hand resting on his holster, a practiced gesture designed to convey authority. His partner, Officer Emily Carter, a young, fresh-faced rookie, hung back slightly, observing the scene with a growing sense of unease. "License and registration, please," Anderson said, his voice gruff and impersonal. The woman, Grace Williams, handed him the documents without a word. She was poised, elegant, her expression calm but unyielding. Anderson glanced at the license. Grace Williams. Address, a well-to-do neighborhood on the other side of town. He looked back at her, his eyes narrowed. "Do you know why I pulled you? Over?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "No, officer, I don't," Grace replied, her voice even and controlled. "I wasn't speeding. I was following all traffic laws." "This is a very nice car," Anderson said, ignoring her statement. "Expensive car. What do you do for a living?" The question was loaded, a thinly veiled accusation. It was a question he wouldn't have asked a white driver in a similar vehicle. Emily, standing behind him, shifted uncomfortably. She'd seen this behavior from Anderson before, this tendency to target people of color, to make assumptions based on their race and appearance. She'd always dismissed it as old-school policing. But now, seeing it up close, she felt a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "I'm an attorney," Grace replied, her voice still calm, her gaze unwavering. Anderson scoffed. "An attorney driving? A car like this? Where'd you get the money for a car like this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with prejudice and accusation. Grace's expression didn't change, but Emily saw a flicker of anger in her eyes. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. It was a fishing expedition, driven by bias and a blatant abuse of power. And Emily was starting to realize that she was witnessing something deeply wrong. The traffic stop, already tense and uncomfortable, quickly escalated. Anderson, fueled by his unchecked biases and a growing sense of frustration that Grace wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted, decided to up the ante. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice hardening. Grace hesitated, her eyes meeting his in a silent challenge. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" she asked, her voice still calm but now carrying a hint of steel. "I don't need a reason," Anderson snapped. "I'm giving you an order. Step out of the car." He opened the driver's side door, his hand hovering near his weapon. Grace, realizing that arguing would only make things worse, slowly and deliberately complied. Anderson immediately began to search her, his hands rough and invasive. He patted her down, ignoring her protests, his movements bordering on assault. Emily, watching from a few feet away, felt her stomach churn. This was wrong. This was a clear violation of protocol, a blatant abuse of power. "What are you looking for, officer?" Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly but still maintaining its composure. "Just making sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be," Anderson replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He then proceeded to search her purse, dumping its contents onto the hood of the car. Wallet, keys, phone, makeup, a few personal items. Nothing illegal, nothing even remotely suspicious. Frustrated, Anderson moved on to the car itself. He ripped open the glove compartment, tossed the contents onto the passenger seat, and rummaged through the center console. He pulled up the floor. Mats checked under the seats, his movements increasingly frantic and destructive. Emily watched in growing horror. She knew this was illegal. She knew Anderson was crossing a line. She wanted to say something, to intervene, but fear held her back. Anderson was her senior officer, a veteran with a reputation for being tough, even ruthless. Challenging him could jeopardize her career, her standing within the department. Then she saw it. Anderson, his back to her, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic baggie containing a white, powdery substance. He glanced around quickly, then, with a deft movement, slipped the baggie under the driver's seat of Grace's car. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. Anderson was planting evidence. He was framing an innocent woman. This was beyond wrong. This was criminal. Her fear for a moment was overwhelmed by a surge of righteous anger. She had taken an oath to uphold the law, to protect and serve the community. She couldn't stand by and watch this happen. She had a choice to make, and she knew deep down what she had to do. But the words wouldn't come, not yet. The internal battle raged, the fear battling the emerging spark of courage. Anderson, satisfied that he'd successfully planted the evidence, turned back to Grace, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Looks like we have a problem, Ms. Williams. It seems you were carrying something you shouldn't have been." He reached under the driver's seat and, with a theatrical flourish, pulled out the baggie of white powder. "This looks an awful lot like cocaine, wouldn't you say?" Grace stared at the baggie, her eyes widening in disbelief and horror. "That's not mine," she exclaimed, her voice rising in panic. "I've never seen that before in my life. You planted that. You put it there." Anderson chuckled, a cold, cruel sound. "Now, why would I do that, Ms. Williams? I'm just a police officer, doing my job, protecting the community from dangerous criminals like you." He turned to Emily, his smirk widening. "Officer Carter, I believe we have enough evidence for an arrest. Read Ms. Williams her rights." Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. She'd seen it all. She knew Grace was innocent. She knew Anderson was a liar and a criminal. But the fear, the ingrained respect for authority, the potential consequences of speaking out, held her tongue. Grace, seeing Emily's hesitation, turned to her, her eyes pleading. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice trembling, "you saw him. You saw what he did. Please, tell the truth." Her words, simple yet powerful, pierced through Emily's fear. They echoed with the weight of injustice, with the desperation of an innocent woman facing a fabricated charge. Emily thought of her father, a retired judge, a man of unwavering integrity who had instilled in her a deep respect for the law and a commitment to justice. He had always told her, "The truth is the strongest weapon, Emily. Never be afraid to use it." She thought of the oath she had taken, the promise she had made to uphold the law, to protect the innocent, to serve the community. Could she live with herself if she remained silent, if she allowed this injustice to stand? The answer, finally, was clear. "Stop!" Emily said, her voice shaking at first, but quickly gaining strength. "Don't do it, Mark!" Anderson turned to her, his eyes narrowed in disbelief and fury. "What did you say?" "I said stop," Emily repeated, her voice now firm and resolute. I saw you plant that baggie. She's innocent." A hush fell over the scene. The only sound was the gentle hum of the idling police cars and the distant murmur of traffic. "You're out of line, Carter," Anderson snarled, his face turning red with rage. "You're making a big mistake. You'll regret this." "Maybe," Emily replied, her gaze unwavering. "But I won't regret telling the truth. I won't regret standing up for what's right." She looked at Grace, a small, apologetic smile on her face. "I'm sorry, Mum. I should have spoken up sooner." The crowd that had gathered, initially drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion, now watched in stunned silence, sensing that a dramatic shift had just occurred. The balance of power had tilted. The truth, finally, was out, and the consequences, for everyone involved, were about to be profound. The tension on the roadside was thick enough to cut with a knife. Anderson, his face contorted in a mask of fury and disbelief, glared at Emily, his threat hanging heavy in the air. Grace, her eyes still fixed on Emily, saw a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness that had enveloped her. "You're making a big mistake, Carter," Anderson repeated, his voice low and menacing. "A huge mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Grace took a deep breath, a newfound strength surging through her. She reached into her purse, the one Anderson had so carelessly rummaged through, and pulled out a small, leather-bound case. She flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge, emblazoned with the words Lexington Police Department and Captain. "Actually, Officer Anderson," Grace said, her voice now calm, authoritative, and laced with a hint of steel. "I think you have no idea who you're dealing with. I'm Captain Grace Williams, the newly appointed head of this precinct, and you, officer, are in a lot of trouble." The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Anderson's face went from rage to shock to utter abject terror. His jaw dropped, his eyes widened, and all the color drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Captain Williams," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. But what, officer?" Grace asked, her voice sharp and unwavering. "But you thought I was just another black woman you could harass and frame. But you thought you could get away with your little game of planting evidence and abusing your power?" Emily, standing beside Grace, felt a surge of relief and vindication. She had done the right thing. She had stood up for the truth, and now the truth had prevailed. "Officer Carter," Grace said, turning to Emily, "thank you for your integrity. You did the right thing, and I won't forget it." Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It was the only thing I could do, Captain." Anderson, meanwhile, was frantically trying to backpedal, to salvage the situation, to somehow explain away his actions. "Captain, I can explain," he stammered. "It was all a misunderstanding. I thought she was—" "You thought she was what, officer?" Grace interrupted, her voice cold and unforgiving. "You thought she was an easy target? You thought you could abuse your power and get away with it because of the color of her skin?" The crowd that had gathered, initially silent and apprehensive, now began to murmur. Cell phones were out, recording the scene, capturing Anderson's desperate attempts to justify his actions. The news of what had happened and who Grace Williams really was spreading like wildfire. I, Anderson stammered, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Save it, officer," Grace said, her voice filled with contempt. "You're suspended, effective immediately, and I assure you there will be a full investigation into your conduct. You will be held accountable for your actions." The tables had turned. Completely, the hunter had become the hunted. The abuser was now facing the consequences of his abuse. And the woman he had tried to frame, the woman he had underestimated and dismissed, was now his superior officer, the person who held his fate in her hands. The scene, captured on dozens of cell phones, was about to become a very public lesson in the dangers of prejudice, the abuse of power, and the ultimate triumph of justice. The immediate aftermath of Grace's revelation was a flurry of activity. Mark Anderson, stripped of his badge and his authority, was escorted away from the scene, his face a mask of shame and disbelief. The two officers who had initially assisted him, now acutely aware of their complicity, stood in stunned silence, their careers hanging in the balance. Grace, now officially in command, addressed the assembled crowd, her voice calm but firm. "This incident," she declared, "will be fully investigated. I assure you anyone found to have violated the law or the public trust will be held accountable." Her words were met with a mixture of applause and cheers. The community, long accustomed to feeling powerless in the face of police misconduct, now saw a glimmer of hope, a chance for real change. True to her word, Grace immediately launched an internal investigation into Mark Anderson's actions. His personnel file was reviewed, revealing a history of complaints, reprimands, and allegations of excessive force, all of which had been conveniently overlooked or dismissed by his superiors. The investigation also uncovered evidence of other instances of racial profiling, false arrests, and even planting evidence, a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. The findings of the investigation were made public, sparking outrage and demands for reform. The incident became a national news story, highlighting the pervasive problem of police misconduct and the urgent need for greater accountability and transparency. Emily Carter, initially hesitant to speak out, became a key witness in the investigation. Her testimony, honest and unflinching, provided crucial evidence against Anderson and helped to expose the systemic failures that had allowed his behavior to continue for so long. She was hailed as a hero, a symbol of integrity and courage, a police officer who had chosen to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. For Emily, the experience was transformative. She had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of unchecked power and the importance of standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. She rededicated herself to her career, determined to be a force for good within the police department, to be the kind of officer who truly served and protected all members of the community. The incident also galvanized the community. Citizens, inspired by Grace's leadership and Emily's courage, organized protests, demanded meetings with city officials, and called for comprehensive police reform. They demanded more training, better oversight, and a greater emphasis on community policing and de-escalation techniques. The story of Grace Williams and Mark Anderson became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the abuse of power. But it also became a story of hope, a testament to the power of individual courage, the importance of community action, and the enduring possibility of achieving justice, even in the face of systemic injustice. It was a turning point, not just for Lexington, but for the ongoing national conversation about race, policing, and the pursuit of a more equitable society. This narrative, unfolding in Lexington, Kentucky, offers a powerful and timely commentary on the complexities of justice, prejudice, and the responsibilities that come with authority. It's a story that resonates deeply, particularly for those of us who have witnessed firsthand the long struggle for civil rights and understand the enduring need for vigilance and courage in the face of injustice. One of the most profound lessons is the critical importance of integrity, even when, especially when, it's difficult. Officer Emily Carter's initial hesitation to speak out is understandable given the potential repercussions, but her ultimate decision to tell the truth, to stand up against a corrupt superior officer, is a testament to the power of individual conscience. As we age, we accumulate a wealth of experience, and we understand the profound impact that our choices, both large and small, can have on the world around us. This story reminds us that integrity is not a passive virtue. It's an active choice, a commitment to doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. It is never too late to speak up. The story also underscores the insidious nature of unchecked power and the vital need for accountability within institutions. Mark Anderson's abuse of authority, his racial profiling, his willingness to plant evidence were all enabled by a system that failed to hold him accountable. This speaks to a broader truth. Power, without oversight and accountability, can easily corrupt. As elders, we have a unique responsibility to use our voices, our experience, and our influence to demand transparency and accountability from those in positions of authority, whether in law enforcement, government, or any other institution that impacts our lives. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the enduring power of truth and the importance of challenging false narratives. Grace Williams's composure and eventual revelation of her true identity shattered Mark Anderson's carefully constructed facade of lies and prejudice. This reminds us that truth, however inconvenient or uncomfortable, is ultimately the strongest weapon against injustice. As we age, we gain a deeper appreciation for the importance of truth-telling, of sharing our stories, and of challenging narratives that perpetuate prejudice and discrimination. Finally, the story offers a message of hope and the possibility of systemic change. Grace's leadership, Emily's courage, and the community's response demonstrate that even deeply entrenched problems like police misconduct and racial bias can be addressed through collective action, persistent advocacy, and a commitment to justice. It reminds us that progress is possible, that change can happen, and that we all have a role to play in creating a more equitable and just society. As elders, we can offer guidance, support, and mentorship to younger generations, sharing our experiences and inspiring them to continue the fight for a better world. The most powerful weapon against injustice is our voice.